Ted Cruz is a senator. I'll let that sad reality continue to sink in for people in chat. But he recently had a hearing, and this hearing had to do with voter ID laws. And they had some legal scholars present for the Senate hearing for the senators to ask them questions for both their own personal knowledge and the public knowledge, since this was broadcasted, obviously. And Ted Cruz had a heated back and forth with one of the professors, where I think that Ted Cruz kind of acted a little bit like a spoiled child. And so I wanted to look at this interaction and get your guys' opinions on it.
Chairman, I want to start with a question for each of the 5 witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist? Professor Tolson.
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr.
By the way, can I just say, she attempts to like add nuance to her answer. Like, well, it depends. Like, some voter ID laws aren't, some are. It depends on how they're implemented. Maybe, you know, the Supreme Court has ruled certain voter ID laws to be racist in the past because they targeted black guys. She was gonna go into that most likely, and immediately like, nah, which ones are racist? And then he wants to move on. Like, he wants to get his talking points out. Doesn't want the nuance. Whatever. Let's listen to him.
Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay.
Wait. Go back. I want you guys to hear that interaction one more time.
Quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about
Listen to the amount of nuance Ted Cruz, in one fell swoop, just yanks away from what she was saying. Like, well, I believe some voter ID laws are and some aren't. It depends on the situation. Okay, can you give me an example? Well, I believe your state has had a bad history with voter ID laws. Oh, so all of Texas is racist? She didn't say that. She just said that I think your state has had some racist voter ID laws. That's all she said, which we actually have some legal documents we're going to be looking at in a second. Well, not legal documents, but articles about legal documents and legal decisions by courts and appellate courts. Talking about this in a second, we'll look at after we finish the clip.
Requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me, what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting
intent,
that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist. How about you, Mr. Yang?
I agree with Professor Tolson. Voter ID laws can be racist.
Okay, that's
on the
2.
context.
Mr. Science?
There are some voter ID laws that are racially discriminatory in intent.
How about
Wow, look at that. It's almost like there's nuance to be had here. Now, before we watch the rest of this, let's talk about what that the history of Texas's voter ID laws are. Now, I just brought up, now I didn't bring up like some liberal think tank. I just brought up just the Brennan Center for Justice that just tracks the history of Texas's, let's say, relationship with voter ID laws. Specifically, one that was put into place, I believe, in 2011. Okay, so, signed into law in 2011, SB 14 was the strictest voter ID law in the nation. Texas previously allowed voters to prove their identity using a wide variety of documents. But SB 14 required voters to present an unexpired voter ID from a list of only 7 acceptable documents. Experts estimated that more than 600,000 registered Texas voters and many more unregistered but eligible voters did not have an ID approved under law. Per the requirements of the Voting Rights Act at the time, Texas filed a federal lawsuit seeking pre-clearance to enforce SB 14. The Brennan Center and co-counsel represented the Texas NAACP and MALC in opposition in Texas v. Holder. In August 2012, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia rejected the law, ruling that Texas was unable to prove that the law would not discriminate against African Americans and Latino voters. Following the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which eliminated the requirement that Texas receive pre-clearance, the state announced that it would implement SB 14. So they were going to implement it even though it was previously rejected because they couldn't prove that it wasn't racist as fuck. In response, the Brennan Center, along with lawyers for the Committee of Civil Rights and NAACP, a bunch of other people, filed a complaint. Now let's look at the case timeline and what happened here. So, following the Supreme Court's decision, the Brennan Center filed the complaint. In 2014, following a 9-day trial, the District Court for the Southern District of Texas held that it violates Section 2 of the VRA by impersonably abridging African Americans and Latinos' access to the ballot. Okay. That's the first thing. Okay? That's the first time it was shot. Well, actually, the second time it was technically shot down. Then you go down here. What's this? On August 5th, 2015, a 3-judge panel on the 5th Circuit Court unanimously, not a divisive decision, unanimously affirmed the district court's holding that SB 14 has a racially discriminatory impact in violation of Section 2 of VRA. Then you go to the 5th Circuit, issued a declaration largely tracking the key conclusions of the panel. The court upheld the district's ruling again. And so after all of these times, it got shot down again and again and again and again for being racist. Eventually, they're like, okay, we tap. And they changed the law just enough so it could get through in about 2017. And that's why following the administration change in 2017, the DOJ dropped its intentional discrimination claim. The private plaintiffs group, however, included those represented by the Brennan Center, maintained that claim. After reweighing the evidence in light of the 5th Circuit's guidance, the district court again ruled the Texas legislature enacted SB 14 with the intent to discriminate against minority voters. Oh, wait, no, actually I missed one. They ruled against it again, even during the Trump administration. Sorry. There was another court decision against it. Okay, there's another one. Okay. And then in June 2017, they passed a new voter ID law, SB 5, which it claimed remedied the effects of SB 14, but which, in fact, perpetuated those effects. The private plaintiffs submitted briefings on the issue of remedy. Plaintiffs asked for a declaratory judgment, yada, yada, yada. Basically, eventually they were able to shove it through. But if you look at the individual people who, heard this case, all of them, filed opinions, and many of those opinions were still saying, this is not a law that should be enacted in Texas. It still violates it. Anyway, this is what we're talking about. So they did file, for years, a racist voter ID law, okay? This is not me, even trying to put a spin on it. This is just a decision of courts again and again and again and again and again, okay? And so this is a different law that eventually they had to basically tap out and pass a different one because they couldn't get the first one through because they couldn't kept ruling that it was racist. Anyway. Oh, and in August 23rd, 2017, the district court found that SB 5 perpetuates the discriminated features of SB 14. The court issued an order striking down both laws. So they go in, they tap out, they try this new thing, bam. And then finally, in 2018, a divided panel of 5th Circuit Court of Appeals issued a decision permitting Texas to implement SB 5, not the original one, but the second one that was shot down a year before, the 2017 version of the voter ID law. So yes, okay, I know that was a little convoluted, but you just see that story of Texas and voter ID laws is a story of it just getting shot down again and again and again and again and again for being discriminatory towards African Americans and Latinos. And even when they go okay, let's try this law instead, that still gets shot down before eventually being able to get through a divided court. So yes, I think saying that Texas has a history with racist voter ID laws is completely fair. Also, I see Doghouse in chat, and I see More Perfect Union in chat. How you going, boys? How's it going?
In practice, in intent, fine, you say there's some racist with a malevolent intent lurking in the back of their mind. But let's just talk about it as a practical matter. When I go to vote, they ask me for my ID. I pull out my ID, I show it to them, I vote. Is that racist?
If the law that requires you to do that was motivated by racially discriminatory intent
What about the
under
effect?
our
Set aside
Constitution.
intent. Set aside intent. I'm asking about the effect.
Actually, that's actually a good point Ted brought up. If it's about effect, then the reason why the Texas law was shot down again and again and again didn't even have to do with intent. The law never mentioned race once, just like the one in North Carolina that was shot down by the Supreme Court never mentioned race once. The intent was racially discriminatory. So, not the intent, the effect was racially discriminatory. So if Ted Cruz's argument is about effect, then his argument's even weaker.
Yes, in effect, I think that
Ms.
there are
Reardon.
discriminatory effects from a number of voter ID laws.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reardon.
I'm going to give the witness a chance to answer the question. Go ahead, Mr. Sine.
Yes, in effects, I think many voter ID laws are discriminatory. And in design, they are designed to have that effect.
Okay, Ms. Reardon.
No, sir.
Mr. Van Spakovsky.
No, particularly because every single state that has passed an ID law has put in a provision to provide a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. The turnout numbers show it has no effect, and I would remind...
And again, let's just be clear. The courts disagree with what this man is saying. The Supreme Court, even district courts in Texas, in the state in question, disagree with this man saying. Somebody in chat asked me, like, how could it, I think it was More Perfect Union who asked, what is wrong with a person proving who they are when they vote? I have no problem with that. I have zero problem with that. In fact, Democrats have actually proposed voter ID laws. They have. Right here. Here's a great example of that. 1 second. Where is it? I think this talks about it. But in this article, this talks about how Joe Manchin, actually along with other Democrats, tried to offer a type of voter ID laws. And what happened? It was shot down. Why was that one shot down? Because it wasn't the one that the Republicans wanted. They wanted it either to be more strict, or like was the purpose in North Carolina, and like was the purpose in 2011 with the law they tried to pass then, or S5. The intent of it was not just to prove who you were, and the effect of it was obviously discriminatory.
Everyone that the current version of the Texas voter ID law for in-person voting, the Obama administration agreed in court, in a court filing, that they were satisfied with it and that it was not discriminatory.
You know, I have to say this is the wildly partisan nature of the Democrats' proposal. The record should reflect all three of the Democratic witnesses invited by the chairman maintained to this committee that voter ID laws can be, in many instances, in most instances, I think of the various ways they formulated.
Wait, what do you mean? Now he's just putting words in the mouth. Most instances. They didn't even say that. He's just assuming that. And what he's saying would be equally as true for the Republican witnesses.
Are racist. So let me tell you.
Because if I know anything about Ted Cruz, is he's not partisan. He's not partisan at all. And that is why when a candidate for president, Donald J. Trump, insulted his wife, he stood up proud. He stood up tall and campaigned for him.
Disagrees with that. 35 states across the country disagree with that because 35 states have voter ID laws in effect. But not just 35 states. 81% of voters in America disagree with the radical views proposed by the Democrats and the Democratic witnesses. Not just 81% of Americans. 77% of black voters in America support voter ID laws.
Seriously, Dylan, you can't make the partisan argument. You are partisan. I never claimed that I don't have partisanship in my blood or in my body at all, right? I can be bipartisan on issues like gun control, but other issues I can be partisan. But the idea that Ted Cruz is feigning concern about partisanship on this issue is ridiculous to me. It's hypocritical because Ted Cruz is equally, if not more partisan, and so were the Republican witnesses.
78% of Hispanic voters in America support voter ID laws. Maldev should think about that. 81% of low-income Americans support voter ID laws.
Okay, so polling data is a great point to show that people support whatever you want. But it's not really an argument outside of that. It doesn't say why it'd be good for the country, why it'd be good for democracy, why it'd be good for any of these things. Polling data is just something that proves that something is or isn't popular. But just because something is or isn't popular doesn't mean it's the correct policy. I mean, if you want to make a populist argument, I mean, you can. Obviously, supporting something that's popular is much easier than supporting something that's not popular. But it's not really an argument outside of most people agree with me.
And yet, what this bill is about is putting radicals in charge of saying if you require an ID to vote, that is racist and must be struck down. This is all about partisan power. Now, DOJ has also said, under the Biden administration, that it is not going to presume that that a state acts lawfully.
Most people don't agree with me? Yeah, because I'm a Sigma male and I'm going my own way.
If it simply returns to pre-COVID voting laws. Ms. Reardon, Mr. Van Spakovsky, what does that tell you if they say after a pandemic, if you go back to the laws that existed before, DOJ is not going to assume that that's okay? What does that tell you about?
By the way, I gotta say, for the most powerful country on earth, they have terrible camera equipment in Congress, and the lag here is god-awful.
The partisan nature of DOJ.
80% of Americans support voter ID. Okay, more perfect union. You know what? So do I. So how do they disagree with me? The question is what type of voter ID I support. In effect, I always end up generally not supporting it because the voter ID laws that are placed in front of me aren't the type of voter ID laws that I would want. But I'm not in principle against voter ID.
By issuing the guidance that they did, it says to me that what they would like to do is make permanent the emergency procedures that were instituted by many states through litigation by the DNC throughout the country prior to the 2020 election. And they would like those to be permanent. And so rather than understand that they are temporary, they are going to go after.
Okay. I mostly wanted to show this starting interaction. Most of the rest of this is just basically just pounding like the Democrats. But I just wanted to show just how bad faith Ted Cruz was in this interaction. Anyway, that's enough of that.